On the silver screen, is there a secret history hiding in plain sight? One where dreams, fears, and forbidden ideas flicker in celluloid shadows. In that world, movies are never just entertainment. Instead, they become coded messages from the depths of culture's unconscious, speaking in symbols of paranoia, power, and the paranormal. Let's lower the lights on Tinseltown and discover what lurks in those shadows here on Things Visible and Invisible. Robert Guffey is a writer, academic, and cultural critic best known for his work on conspiracy theories, weird fiction, and popular culture. He is a lecturer in the English department at California State University, Long Beach. As well, he is a writer of both fiction and non-fiction, often exploring themes involving paranoia, the occult, media manipulation, and fringe belief systems. His work includes Hollywood Haunts the World, an investigation into the cinema of occulted taboos. And he joins me down the line from his home in California. Robert, welcome to Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you for inviting me on.
Robert, when I first came across your work, I sort of scratched my head and wondered if Robert's really confirming what the rest of the world's always thought, that it's not Hollywood, but Hollyweird.
That's a pretty good description. I suppose it's odd. I have a friend, Randy Kopang, who wrote a book about UFOs called Camouflage Through Limited Disclosure. For many years now, he's been working on a book called The Hollyweird Book of the Dead. Hollyweird is a pretty good word in the sense that even mainstream Hollywood is Hollyweird. So I guess the topic of Hollywood Haunts the World is kind of like para-Hollyweird or a crypto-Hollyweird. It's taking it even a few steps farther, going all the way back to strange conspiracies and mysterious deaths, like the death of Thelma Todd, the actress who was in the Marx Brothers movies and Bela Lugosi movies, and she died mysteriously. And she was married to the director of The Bat, the classic silent horror film. And, Fatty Arbuckle controversy going all the way forward to the death of Natalie Wood and O.J. Simpson and Charles Manson. Joan Didion, a respected literary writer, made her reputation writing about the weirdness of Los Angeles in books like The White Album. So I suppose you don't even need to get into the kind of hidden tributaries that I cover in Hollywood Haunts the World to call it Hollyweird. But I guess my book is attempting to kind of dig even further down beneath the surface into the crypto Hollyweird, I suppose you could say.
Yes, and I think that's what we're going to be talking about, really, because, I mean, I was only half joking when I talked about Hollyweird. I mean, it's a little bit shorthand today, and it's sometimes got a political connotation as much as anything in these days that we live in. But your work takes it a stage further and into a completely different realm, because what you've done, I think, Robert, is that you've kind of joined the dots, if I may say, that you have looked at different periods of Hollywood history and started to see patterns, and some of them rather disturbing in terms of what that is revealing. So I suppose the question is, where do you want to start, Robert, on this strange odyssey through the other secret history of Hollywood?
As you say, the subtitle of the book is an investigation into the cinema of occulted taboos. So I've been interested in the topic of taboos for a long time, going back to high school when I discovered a comic book series called Taboo, edited by Steve Bissett, who was a comic book artist and writer and still is. And he collaborated with Alan Moore on Swamp Thing, Saga of the Swamp Thing. and later did this anthology called Taboo, which was a series of comic book stories, but they all explored taboos in various ways, and in fictional form and non-fictional form. Alan Moore's and Addie Campbell's Jack the Ripper graphic novel From Hell began in Taboo. Lost Girls by Alan Moore and his wife, Melinda Gebbie, began serialized in Taboo. And that last work I just mentioned, Lost Girls, was not a horror story. It was about sexuality and human sexuality across many different decades and generations, and also examining the difference between what is erotica, what is pornography. Alan Moore's answer is that very often it's a class distinction. If rich people consume pornography, it's called erotica. If poor people consume pornography, it's called pornography. So the series Taboo, it wasn't just exploring horror stories. It was exploring taboos in many different ways. And I think as a teenager, I started thinking about taboos and the topic of it, and what is a taboo, and why are certain things taboo at a particular time period. And it often depends on who's in power at the time. And also, taboos can change on a dime. One day, one thing is taboo, and then the next day, suddenly it's not taboo anymore. And so taboos often tell us a lot about the culture and
Well,
who's in charge.
Well, let's take that and looking at the history of Hollywood. Hollywood, I guess, as a motion picture center, began in the early decades of the 20th century, and certainly by the 1920s was a global phenomena. Were taboos to filmmakers of the time, were taboos something that were attractive in that they would sell tickets? Or were they something that they veered away from, frightened of what the producers or production guilds or whatever would say about it?
I think the answer is both simultaneously at the same time. You want to exploit a taboo just enough. You want to take it to the edge so it's titillating, but not so much that it's rubbing the taboo into the face of the audience so that they consciously know what's going on. That can be the difference between a commercial bomb and a commercial success. So, for example, I have a whole chapter in the book dedicated to what I call Darwinian horror. And Darwinian horror, particularly in cinema, were stories that were covertly about the Scopes monkey trial and Darwinian evolution, which was a topic that could not be taught in schools in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, all the way until, in fact, the late 60s in some states in the United States. So you couldn't do a film that just overtly promoted Darwin's theory of evolution. So instead, you get the topic coming out in the form of these odd horror stories, mostly, or kind of proto science fiction films sometimes. Going as far back as the 1920s, Lon Chaney Sr. did a film called A Blind Bargain, which I heard just recently has been remade with Crispin Glover, oddly enough. But Blind Bargain is a lost film. But going all the way back to the 20s with Lon Chaney's Blind Bargain, going forward into the 1930s with Murders in the Rue Morgue, the Robert Florey film starring Bela Lugosi, supposedly based on the Edgar Allan Poe story, going all the way forward into the 40s, into the 50s, stories about man's connection to the ape, women interbreeding with apes. All these stories revolved around the connection between human lineage and the apes, but it did it in a way where it was disguised as a horror B film, and that was the only way you could do it without, being severely punished by the powers that be. So the taboo is discussed in a hidden way until and that's the pattern I noticed. Eventually, you'll get a film that just deals with the topic nakedly, almost docudrama style. So in this case, when you get to the early '60s, you get Stanley Kramer's *Inherit the Wind*, starring Frederick March and Spencer Tracy, both of whom portrayed Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I think is not a coincidence. I think Stanley Kramer cast them in that role for that reason. They're both playing the opposing attorneys in the Scopes Monkey trial. So that film, Inherit the Wind, just deals with the topic of Darwinian evolution nakedly, no taboo, no B movie trappings in it, because the topic was no longer taboo. So you could actually address it without any metaphors disguising it. And so I trace that pattern through various topics across 100 years, because the book starts in 1921 and goes all the way to 2021.
That's absolutely fascinating, and familiar with many of those films, but I hadn't, as I said at the start, I hadn't joined the dots in the way that you had, Robert, around what might be said. It's interesting that you light upon the subject of horror movies. Horror movies, as we both know, were often seen as kind of B movies a lot of the time, or weren't taken seriously. They were never films that were going to win Oscars, most of them, certainly from the 1930s onwards. Yet they often deal with subject matter. I would imagine that that's kind of in your ballpark, Robert. There's often taboos being dealt with, if only in sort of coded ways, right?
Until recently, horror films historically did not win Academy Awards. This last Academy Award, we had horror films like Sinners and Weapons actually winning these awards. A couple of years prior to that, you had The Shape of Water, the Guillermo del Toro film. And I think you have to go all the way back to Silence of the Lambs to find one that actually won an Academy Award. So, yes, it's always been a debased genre. And I would argue, as someone who's also written horror fiction, it works best when, in fact, it is flying under the radar. And in terms of cinema, I think maybe the best example of that during the 1940s is the Val Lewton films. The films that Val Lewton produced were RKO, films like The Cat People, I Walked with a Zombie. Val Lewton was the head of the horror film B unit at RKO, and it was called the Snake Pit. That was the unit that made the horror films, the Snake Pit, because it was not respected by RKO. They would go to Val Lewton and say, here's a list of titles that we've tested with audiences. The Cat People, I Walked with a Zombie. Make a movie with this title. And they didn't care what the film was, just as long as the film made money. So as long as it made money, it was hands off, and Val Lewton could do whatever the hell he wanted because nobody was really paying attention at the studio. And that was an enviable position for him because he managed to slip past the Hollywood gatekeepers, some of the most subversive films that Hollywood made during that time period. Martin Scorsese said that The Cat People changed the language of cinema because it was dealing with taboo topics of sexuality that could not possibly have been discussed openly. It had to be disguised in metaphorical terms in the context of a horror movie. And so, in fact, Val Lewton had such success making these films that he was lured away to better studios to produce A films. And he soon discovered that he couldn't get away with anything because now all these people were looking at him and watching what he was doing. And in fact, he died a relatively young man. Probably wishing he had stayed in the Snake Pit at RKO. So, in terms of cinema, it's and in terms of, in fact, any artistic endeavor, it's better to find your temporary autonomous zone, as Hakim Bey described it, where you can get away with stuff at least temporarily and stay in that autonomous zone as long as possible until you have to leave. and find someplace else to get away with this kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Um, how much of this, though, Robert, is retrospective revisionism, and how much of it was conscious on the part of filmmakers? Now, I'm aware, and we're probably going to talk about the unconscious and how much that plays a part in any creative endeavor. But how much do you think that the Val Lewtons of this world were actually conscious of what they were doing, as opposed to somebody 30 years later saying, aha, this is what you were saying?
Yes, I think you have both simultaneously. You have people like Val Lewton and Jacques Tourneur, who directed The Cat People, who understood, consciously knew exactly what they were doing. And then, but the beautiful thing is, and I have a whole chapter in Hollywood Haunts the World about surrealism, and how surrealism was such a draw to the avant-garde filmmakers of the time. But of course, you weren't going to get away with something like a Salvador Dali or a Louis Buñuel film in the context of American cinema. But you have all these German expressionist directors fleeing to America prior to and during World War II, setting up shop in America and sitting there thinking, how can I insert expressionism or surrealism into the context of American cinema? Obviously, horror films were the perfect vehicle for that. And so you have people like Edgar Ulmer coming from Germany to the United States, finding a home briefly at Universal Studios, where he made The Black Cat. It was co-written by Ulmer and directed by Ulmer, and starred. It was the first film to pair Bela Lugosi and Karloff together. And that film is just packed, filled with insane taboos. And in that case, you see Ulmer, who was friends with Salvador Dali, you see Ulmer doing this on purpose, trying to see how far can I go. And that film was a huge financial success for Universal Studios in that year. But in this chapter where I talk about surrealism, I also talk about a kind of the best conspiracy is one where the members of the conspiracy do not know that they are part of a conspiracy. And because how can you bust that up, right? If you don't even know you're aware of that you're part of a conspiracy. So there were a lot of people working, particularly in B films in Hollywood in the 1940s, who were doing surreal films and not really aware of it. My friend and colleague Gary D. Rhodes, who wrote the introduction to this book, he interviewed, for example, Gerald Schnitzer, who wrote some of the most memorable of the monogram B horror films that starred Bela Lugosi in the 1940s. And these were considered to be the absolute bottom of the barrel of cinema at the time. Films like The Ape Man.
That's right.
And The Corpse Vanishes and The Bowery at Midnight. And Gerald Schnitzer went on, oddly enough, from writing those Bela Lugosi films to becoming one of the very first Mad Men, like John Hamm, like the John Hamm character in Mad Men. He went on to work. He was the guy who figured out that you could make commercials be little narrative movies, that commercials should be more than just showing the product. They'd be more effective if you told a little story. So he went on from writing insane, surreal Bela Lugosi movies to working in Madison Avenue. But what he told Gary Rhodes was that when he wrote those films, he wrote them often in 2 days or 3 days with no sleep, just working constant 72 hours in a row, because that's what you had to do at that time. Then it was in front of the camera a day later. They would finish the film, and then it would be in theaters like 4 weeks later. And so when you're working that fast, that's sort of like the exquisite corpse technique that the surrealists were using, automatic writing. You don't have time to think about it. You don't have time to edit it. So it's almost just like pure unconscious being transmitted from your brain onto the screen. And so those films were considered to be completely just bottom of the barrel. But from the perspective of 2026, looking at it now, you can see how those films, they look like surrealist masterpieces.
Fascinating. Now, there's been a lot written about the horror genre and the subconscious and how it plays in together. And you're right to reference Germany and the Weimar Republic and how that was all imported into Hollywood. Probably something which probably has been as much written about, but maybe not as thought as much about, which is the whole business of science fiction. As a genre, science fiction took a long time, equally to break into the mainstream, shall we say. Today, a lot of the younger people watching this will think that science fiction is completely normal and part of mainstream Hollywood. But for a long time, it was up there with horror movies, or down there with horror movies in terms of the bargain bin. It was something that wasn't taken seriously, and yet there's a sort of strain of sci-fi movies which I wonder if you would equally posit as the repository for this kind of unconscious dreaming, this unconscious thought, or even running alongside, parallel to scientific breakthroughs. What do you think?
Yes, so science fiction is the mainstream now. So, like what I was saying earlier about Hakim Bey's theory about the temporary autonomous zone, I suppose if you were going to tackle a taboo topic in 2026, you'd have to find some other venue in order to do it, because it is mainstream now, and people are looking at it because it, post Star Wars, that's the money making machine, whereas before it wasn't really being looked at. So in both in cinema and in literature, if you look at someone like Philip K. Dick, who was cranking out incredible surrealist, proto psychedelic masterpieces in the form of these cheap paperbacks that you could buy for 25 cents at the local spin rack at the drugstore. Phil Dick had to pump out 6 of those books a year just to eke out even a meager existence. Nonetheless, he wrote books like Eye in the Sky and Time Out of Joint in the 1950s. And I don't think you could have gotten away with works as experimental as that at any major American publisher at that time. So even though Phil Dick didn't have a lot of financial success until the very end of his life when Blade Runner was being made, nonetheless, he had that autonomy to crank out these books because science fiction was really one step above pornography at that time in the 50s. And then in cinema, at the same time, you had people like Kurt Siodmak, who wrote The Wolfman in 1941 and later wrote films like Earth versus the Flying Saucers, ostensibly based on Donald Keough's ufological books. Kurt Siodmak wrote a film called Creature with the Atom Brain, 1955, directed by Edward L. Kahn. And Creature with the Atom Brain is fascinating, and I discuss this in the book, because Siodmak, in his memoir, Wolfman's Maker, which was published in 2000, right after he died, he claimed that he was approached by the OSS, which was the progenitor of the CIA, in the 1940s when he published a now classic science fiction book, Donovan's Brain, which is all about controlling people from afar, action at a distance, the dream of the military for decades, controlling someone to kill from afar. And after this book was published, the OSS approached Kurt Siodmak and said, "You're the kind of guy we want working for us." Now, he doesn't say in the book what it was he did for the OSS, but I would assume that if the OSS approaches a writer and wants the writer to work for them, he would be writing for them. And if he's a science fiction writer, he would be writing science fiction for them. And I think it's interesting that in Creature with the Atom Brain, it's all about, ostensibly, the surface plot is that it's about an ex-mafia guy teams up with this ex-Nazi scientist, and they are reanimating dead people and using these reanimated corpses as remote-controlled assassins, proto-Manchurian candidates. Now, the technology that is discussed in the film, if you take away the zombie aspect of the story, is exactly what a fellow named Dr. Jose Delgado was doing for the government for MK Ultra, which was a top secret project at that time until the lid was blown off it in the 1970s. But in 1955, when this film was released, no one knew who Jose Delgado was, and very few people know who he is today. And yet he is almost named by name in the film. There's no doubt that the characters in the film are talking about Delgado's work in the movie. And so my personal theory is that Kurt Siodmak knew about Delgado and his work and what he was doing, and decided to disguise it in the form of this B horror or science fiction film, because otherwise you'd be violating the security oaths. So fiction has always served that function of being able to discuss taboo topics without getting the writer burned at the stake, thrown in prison, or killed.
How much of that, Robert, is fascinating what you've just said there, but how much of that was people wanting to discuss something which is taboo, or the powers that be allowing this discussion to happen for their own purposes?
Okay, so that's a very good question, because you have both strains going on at the same time. And in fact, in my first book, which is called Cryptoschatology, crypto, Latin for secret, scatology, the study of feces. And so you put it together, it's the study of secret feces. So that was the word I made up to describe my specialty. And so cryptoschatology, in that book, I have a chapter called Science Fiction is Manipulation. And I talk about how there's always been two strains of science fiction. There's been that kind of questioning, progressive, taboo shattering, subversive kind of fiction that Phil Dick was writing. And then you always had another strain, which was a kind of more militaristic, propagandistic form of science fiction that I think was meant to massage the brains of the masses. And you have a lot of people involved in the military writing science fiction. In fact, one of the writers I talk about in that chapter in Cryptoschatology was a writer named Cordwainer Smith, whose real name was Paul Linebarger. And Cordwainer Smith wrote very peculiar stories in the 50s and 60s, one of which was called Golden the Ship Was, OOO. And so I appropriate that title for the chapter in my book called Golden the Film Was, OOO, which is that particular chapter is all about the link between Hollywood being used as a venue for propaganda. And so Cordwainer Smith wrote this very peculiar story. And it's interesting that Paul Linebarger was the father of psychological warfare. He literally wrote the book on psychological warfare. The title of the book is, in fact, Psychological Warfare, and it was published in 1948, I believe, just after World War II. And so simultaneous with writing this book about psychological warfare, he's writing these very peculiar science fiction stories under a pseudonym, Cordwainer Smith. And so this one particular story, Golden the Ship Was, OOO, is all about a battle in the future, in outer space. And there's this one particular civilization that is going from planet to planet and just wiping out whole civilizations, and then going on to the next planet and wiping out the next civilization. And there's this one planet that knows that it's in the course of this oncoming invasion, and they know they don't have the resources or the technology to withstand this much superior race. So they come up with this idea of this golden ship, and they plant clues all around the galaxy that they have in their possession this massive golden ship that can destroy planets. And they don't actually have this thing, but they make fake photographs and fake sightings throughout the solar system so that it seems as if they have it. And to the point where this oncoming horde of ravagers decides maybe we should just bypass that planet. Why risk it? And so you can see the story as being Cordwainer Smith's sort of science fiction parable about the techniques that were being used at the time. And so I apply that to not only the ufological UFO sightings that were being planted, sometimes on purpose, in the newspapers at that time, but also the science fiction films that were being made, like The Man from Planet X, which I devote an entire chapter to, that very often some of these UFO sightings may not have been propaganda directed at the American public necessarily, but directed at foreign adversaries. We know that Stalin, for example, was very interested in the topic of UFOs and had spies in the American Southwest trying to figure out what we knew about the flying saucers. So one wonders if there wasn't actually an intelligence operation to make adversaries think that we have access to advanced alien technology. And I think that might explain some of the more peculiar UFO sightings that were in the newspaper at the time, and also why so many of these science fiction films of the 50s dealt with alien invasions, crashed saucers, and also why so many people who were involved in military intelligence were involved in producing and writing these films.
Absolutely. Now you've alluded to it already, Robert. The film The Manchurian Candidate, which, if anybody isn't aware of it, was film I think released in '62. So it was released before the JFK assassination. But a film which still today resonates with a lot of people in terms of what it was saying, or what it was predicting, or what it was referring to in the past in terms of the Korean War and mind control and some of the things you've talked about. What's your take on it?
What's interesting, another pattern that I noticed when I was researching the book, was that I noticed that I would watch a film like Creature with the Atom Brain, or let's say The Parallax View from the 1970s, starring Warren Beatty, and I would think, well, there's like signal to noise here. Like, did this film seems to be talking about stuff that was not widely known at the time in terms of MK Ultra mind control experiments, was not known until the 70s, when the lid got blown off the toilet of MK Ultra. And the head of the CIA at the time demanded that all related documents be destroyed. So how was it that Kurt Siodmak, for example, was talking about Jose Delgado? And so then I would look into the background of the writer, and I would see, Kurt Siodmak claimed that he was, recruited by the OSS. So here I am watching, for example, The Parallax View, which is also about mind control. And I think, well, who wrote this? Okay, it's Lauren Singer wrote it. Who's Lauren Singer? So you see that the book was published before the revelations of MK Ultra. So what was he drawing upon? Well, Lauren Singer, it turns out, was also a member of the OSS. And and in the case of Richard Condon, who wrote The Manchurian Candidate, and also another book called Winter Kills, which is an important overlooked film that stars the young Jeff Bridges and John Huston. Winter Kills, that Condon was not an insider like Siodmak or Lauren Singer. However, before becoming a novelist, he worked as a PR guy in Hollywood. And as a result, he came to know a lot of important figures and become acquainted with them quite closely. And among those people were people like Howard Hughes and people like Joseph Kennedy. And he said that knowing these people, rubbing elbows with them, turned him into an anti-authoritarian. And so when he was writing books like Manchurian Candidate, he thought he was writing satire. But then later on, he met my late friend and colleague, Walter Boart, who wrote the book Operation Mind Control in the 1970s. That was really the first book to talk about the CIA's mind control operations in a realistic context. It was called operation mind control. So Boart was claiming this was operational, not just experimental. And Richard Condon wrote the introduction to Walter's book. And in that introduction, the book came out in 78. In that introduction, Condon talks about how when I wrote The Manchurian Candidate, I thought I was writing satire. And then now reading Walter Boart's book, I realized it wasn't satire. And very often, I mean, I've had that experience too, where you write a story, you think it's fiction, you think you're pulling out some wild idea from the back of your unconscious. And then a few years later, it comes to pass. I mean, I wrote a novel, I published it in 2017 called Until the Last Dog Dies. And the whole plot of the novel is about a virus that goes pandemic. It goes around the world. And it doesn't kill you. It just kills the sense of humor centers of the brain. So the book is told from the point of view of a stand-up comedian. And halfway through the book, he comes down with the illness. And so the humor starts leaking out of the book. And then a few years later, we had a global pandemic and everyone lost their sense of humor. So I don't know. I don't know where that came from. I didn't have any inside sources. Perhaps the Illuminati beamed this idea into my brain. I suppose that's possible. But Condon had a similar experience where he writes the Manchurian Candidate thinking he's writing satire, and then later on reads Walter Boart's book and agrees to write the introduction to it and says, oh, I guess it wasn't satire after all. But I think that his being in the orbit of these very powerful men gave him some insight so that his satire turned out to be closer to reality than even he could have imagined.
Do you think, Robert, in your research, is that organizations like the CIA have always been interested in Hollywood, interested in how to shape public consciousness on a particular subject or in a particular direction?
Oh, yes. And in the chapter I mentioned before, Golden the Film was, I talk about, this isn't a theory. This isn't a conspiracy theory. The FOIA requests and journalists throughout the decades have looked at this topic. And there are several books that deal with it head on. There's David Robb's Operation Hollywood, which came out like 2004. That's a very good book about that topic. Daniel Riab's Orwell Subverted. That book focuses entirely on the CIA's funding of the animated film Animal Farm in the 50s because they were trying to promote anti-communism. And in fact, that film was shown to my English class when I was in high school in the 80s. And by the way, this year, there's a new animated version of Animal Farm coming out that's produced by the same studio that did Sound of Freedom. So that's interesting. Tricia Jenkins wrote one of the best. It's called The CIA in Hollywood, How the Agency Shapes Film and Television. And in there, she goes into really specific detail, interviewing producers of like television shows like The Agency, where they go into extreme detail about their consultants who worked for, the FBI or the CIA or whatever three-letter intelligence agency, actually requesting that they put certain storylines into their TV shows. And in exchange, they get it's a quid pro quo. I mean, the producers are getting story ideas, and then the CIA they're getting their whatever agenda they want promoted, sent out all around the world in the form of these fictional narratives. And there's one point in Tricia Jenkins' book where the producer for The Agency, this television show that was like an intelligence thriller kind of thing back in the early, post 9/11. His CIA consultant requested a particular plot line be inserted, and it had something to do with this technology that didn't exist. And the producers thought it was an odd request because up to that point, they had been trying as much as possible to be a realistic show, not science fiction. And so the consultant for the CIA said, well, no, we want this in here because it involves something about terrorists being able to be tracked. And he said, well, terrorists watch TV too. So in other words, they wanted potential terrorists to be afraid of this technology that did not exist. So put it in this show that's otherwise realistic, and it'll seem as if, oh, the people who wrote this show, they must know something. They must have this technology. So that's just like one example of a TV show being used to put forward a covert agenda. Because when the CIA is asked about these things, they'll say, "Oh, when we consult a show, it's just so that we can make sure that everything is realistic." We're not inserting any kind of propaganda into the show. But in that case, you see an example of no, there's actually a purposeful use of the TV show to put forward misinformation or disinformation, and so you always have those two strains. In Cryptoschatology, my first book, I have a chapter about surrealism, and if you read that chapter in connection with the chapter that's about surrealism and Hollywood Haunts the World, you can see how the two things connect. And in Cryptoschatology, I talk about two strains of surrealism: guerrilla surrealism and corporate surrealism, and how Andre Breton, the father of surrealism, his intent was that surrealism be subversive. And he was quite dumbfounded decades later into the 1950s when he realized that Madison Avenue had somehow figured out how to exploit surrealism and use it in their advertising.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But Robert, I mean, the idea of propaganda within films, covert or overt, is nothing new. And we look back on some of the films from the 1950s, for example, and it's very clear the Cold War paranoia that was shaping them in sort of very blunt ways. However, there's another strand of films which people point to, which talk of a kind of slightly more maybe nefarious element within Hollywood, and that is of the occult symbolisms and a sort of... I'm thinking of films, for example, as old as Rosemary's Baby or as recent as Eyes Wide Shut, these type of ideas that there's somehow kind of occult messaging going on through filming, and it's something which the cognoscenti are aware of, but us in the masses are just being sort of programmed in a way. What's your take on all of that?
I sort of addressed that in the final chapter. The book is structured reverse chronology. In other words, I start with the most recent films first and go backwards in time, back to 1921. So the earliest film I deal with is a film called The Phantom Carriage, written and directed and starring Victor Sjostrom, who was actually very influential on a small scale. You can see traces of The Phantom Carriage in Kubrick's The Shining, for example. Charlie Chaplin said that Sjostrom was the greatest director alive, back in the 1920s. And this film, The Phantom Carriage, on the surface, if you just, watching it, not really paying attention to it, you'd think that maybe you could interpret it as a kind of darker version of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. You could see it as a kind of Christian parable. And I think that's on purpose, kind of plausible deniability there, because you look deeper into it. And as I was watching it, I was seeing Masonic symbolism. I was seeing theosophical symbolism. And I thought, am I imagining that, and similar to the pattern I discussed earlier, where I'm watching a movie like The Parallax View, then I look into the background of the writer and I see, oh, Lawrence Singer was an OSS agent. Okay, I wasn't just imagining it. In this case, I look into Victor Sjostrom's background, and he was very interested in theosophy. And in fact, the writer of the novel upon which The Phantom Carriage was based, she was a theosophist. And Victor Sjostrom actually collaborated with her on the screenplay. And so you see traces of like Masonic initiations in The Phantom Carriage. And so that ties in, with the occulted taboo, occulted meaning hidden, the hidden taboo, that theosophy and these sort of alternative metaphysics that was going on, in the early 20s, that was not something that you could just nakedly discuss in a Hollywood film or in any film at that time. And so so you have Sjostrom shaping a kind of theosophical / Masonic hermetic parable. But if you weren't paying attention, you might interpret it as a Christian narrative about redemption and sin and redemption and such like. But if you dig a little deeper, you pull the layers of the onion back, and you can see, no, at the core of it, there's more sort of occult symbolism at the center of it, which I find fascinating. And there's a whole strain of conspiracy theory called predictive programming. Like people like James Shelby Downard and Michael A. Hoffman, who wrote Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare, have talked about predictive programming. And I don't. Hollywood has always been used as a conduit for propaganda, and that can be absolutely demonstrated with historical documents. In terms of the idea of predictive programming, which is a more sort of metaphysical concept, it suggests that, for example, the pilot episode of the TV series The Lone Gunmen is probably one of the most infamous examples of this, because the plot was about remote controlled planes being used to bring down the World Trade Center. And the episode aired a year before 9/11. Oddly enough, I just read an interview with Vince Gilligan, who, the creator of Breaking Bad and Pluribus, who co-wrote that episode. And in this interview, they actually asked Vince Gilligan, and it's the first interview I've ever seen where an interviewer actually asked him about that episode, The Lone Gunmen. And in the interview, Vince Gilligan said, I was supposed to go out and work out on September 11th. I woke up late. My friend called me, and I immediately said, oh, man, I overslept. I'm sorry. We were supposed to meet at the gym. And his friend said, I don't think we're going to the gym today. Turn on the TV. And Vince Gilligan turns on the TV just in time to see the second plane hit. And it took him a few minutes, and then he thought, wait a minute, why is this like deja vu? And then he realized, oh, wait a minute, I wrote this. And Vince Gilligan claims that, this was a complete surprise, and I don't disbelieve him. As I said with this book I wrote, Until the Last Dog Dies, about writing this global pandemic story, I suppose somebody might pick that up and think, what kind of inside track did this guy have? But I was just making something up. And Vince Gilligan claims that they were just making something up. So these kind of weird, wild synchronicities do occur, because I've experienced it myself. So that might explain some of these kind of predictive programming examples that people use. Who knows? It's fascinating that you do see some of these things sort of predicted in older films. And is that synchronicity, or is it on purpose? I think it's up in the air.
Tell people where they can find out more about you, Robert, and where they can pick up a copy of one of your many books.
Well, Hollywood Haunts the World you can get it either directly through the publisher, headpress.com, or through Amazon. And in fact, all my books are on Amazon. And my website is cryptoscatology.com. cryptoscatology.com. I made it easy for people. Cryptoscatology.com. And Hollywood Haunts the World, just nominated for a Rondo Award, by the way. It didn't win, but it was nominated, and I was pleased by that. And please pick up a copy of the book. I think you will be entertained and informed.
For now, Robert, thank you so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.